what we call the proton motive force that I defined mathematically last period. And this is where the energy is stored as an intermediate. The net membrane potential is used to drive protons across the ATP synthase back into the membrane, the matrix, and that is harnessed to the synthesis of ATP. So that's the overall scheme of the mitochondrial respiratory chain. The electrons flow from NADH through these three complexes to oxygen to make water. The energy is harnessed to pump the protons and establish a membrane potential. That then drives the synthesis of ATP. Okay, so that's the overall process. We talked last period about cytochrome C and how that acts as a mobile shuttle in carrying the electrons one at a time from the BC1 complex to cytochrome oxidase. We then talked about the mechanism of cytochrome oxidase and how that couples the energy of electron transfer from cytochrome C to oxygen to pump protons across the membrane. So what I'm going to talk about today are these other three complexes, cytochrome BC1, complex 1, and then ATP synthase, where all of this energy is finally conserved by synthesizing ATP. So let's first of all talk about cytochrome BC1. Again, it is an enormous complex. It has a molecular weight of about 500,000. It contains, as you can see here, a bunch of redox centers, three cytochromes, cytochrome C1, cytochrome BL, and cytochrome BH. And it contains two quinol reaction sites, one towards the outside of the membrane we call QO, one towards the inside of the membrane we call QI. And it also contains this interesting iron-sulfur center. So let's look at a kind of a blow-up of this reaction now. And here it is. This is a reaction in cartoon form. And the metal centers again, cytochrome BL, cytochrome BH towards the bottom of the membrane, BL towards the top of the membrane, cytochrome C1, that is the one that directly reacts with cytochrome C, and then this iron-sulfur protein, which contains two irons and two sulfurs ligated within this protein. And we have investigated this here at the University of Arkansas using this ruthenium technique. Again, many of these reactions are too rapid to measure by traditional methods, and so the ruthenium technique allowed these to be measured. Now, as we saw in the previous overall slide, the coenzyme Q reacts according to what we call a Q cycle mechanism. And this is the net number of Qs reacting. On the outside, a net number of two QH2s transfer their electrons to this QO site. And then on the inside, a net of one Q is reduced to QH2 on the inside side. Now these don't both occur at the same time. This is one after the other. So let me go through this again. The first QH2 comes in, and it sits there, as I've indicated, at the QO site. It delivers its electron to the iron-sulfur center, then to C1, and then to cytochrome C. It then becomes a half-reduced quinone that we call a semiquinone, Q dot minus. That delivers its electron to cytochrome BL, then to cytochrome BH, and then it reduces coenzyme Q at the QI site to a semiquinone Q dot minus. That's the first half of the cycle. The second half of the cycle is the second of these QH2s comes in and repeats everything the same way. First electron goes there, second electron goes there, but now it reduces the semiquinone to QH2. And the net reaction of all of this Q cycle here is that 2 protons are taken up from the inside and 4 protons are delivered to the outside. Now you might think that 2 and 4 doesn't add up, and it doesn't. However, other 2 protons come from complex 1 when the Q is initially reduced. So those two there do add up to the total of 4 that are delivered to the outside. Okay, now there's an interesting little story that goes on here. When people first did the X-ray crystal structure of this protein, they saw that this iron-sulfur protein was present in 2 positions. One down here, where it could accept an electron from QH2. That position is much too far from C1 to allow electron transfer directly from there to there. But they discovered that this iron-sulfur protein is also in a position up here where it is close to the C1 and can deliver an electron. So they proposed that this molecule rotates. But none of these kinetics had ever been actually measured. So we used the ruthenium technique, and what we did is we started setting this whole thing up just like you see here. We zapped the ruthenium with a very short laser flash. That pulled an electron out of cytochrome C, pulled an electron from C1 to C, and then initiated this entire electron transport chain. So again, with a single flash, we are able to initiate the entire electron transfer chain of this cytochrome BC1 molecule and see the rapid kinetics of this reaction with QH2. And what we discovered is that the rate-limiting step in the reaction with C1, between iron sulfur and C1, is actually the rotation of this iron sulfur protein. So we are actually able to measure the rate of that rotation by the ruthenium technique. Now, there is a bit of a mystery here, and that is the following. Thermodynamically, the iron sulfur center, the C1 and C, have very positive redox potentials, around 0.25 volts. Cytochrome BL and BH have less positive potentials, around 0 volts. Thermodynamically, it would be much more favorable for all the electrons in QH2 to be delivered up in that direction there. Okay? That's what would be favorable thermodynamically. But somehow this protein prevents that. It causes only the first electron to go up there and then requires the second electron to go through this little cycle here. And what that does is that it allows the proton pumping to occur. If we didn't have this little process where one electron goes that way and the other electron is forced to go that way, then we would not get the proton pumping. So our research and those of other laboratories around the world that are studying this are trying to understand why this protein allows only the first electron to go that way and requires the second electron to go through this cycle involving DL and DH. Now, this next slide, I think, just shows some experimental data that we've done here. Again, we set it up in exactly the same way here. And if we sit on a wavelength that is 552 nanometers, that is sensitive only to the reduction state of C1, we see when we first excite the ruthenium complex with a short laser flash, we get very fast oxidation of that C1. We pull the electron out. And then we see a re-reduction here with a rate constant of 60,000. And that corresponds to that electron transfer there, but it is rate limited by that actual movement, that rotation of the iron sulfur center. Then at a slower time scale, this is found here, this is a wavelength of 561 nanometers that's sensitive to the cytochrome BH. That is reduced to the slower rate, and that is rate limited by that reaction between QH2 and iron sulfur protein. So we've been able to measure all of these rate constants by the ruthenium technique. And we're able to determine that motion there is what is rate limiting. Now we think that we have solved this mystery of how we prevent that short circuit. What we believe is occurring here is that the motion of this iron sulfur is not just
random, but it is regulated. It can only carry one electron at a time, so when the QH2 transfers its first electron to the iron sulfur center, it rotates up there, delivers it to C1 and then to cytochrome C, but it does not come back. It's prevented from coming back until the semiquinone delivers its electron to Bl and BH and then Q down here. So we believe now that the rotation of this iron sulfur protein is controlled so that we prevent the short circuit reaction that would be thermodynamically more favorable. So that rotation, we believe, is actually controlled by the protein. And here is the actual crystal structure of cytochrome BC1. This was done by our collaborator, Chang-An Yu at Oklahoma State University, and also several other workers around the world. And we have here two pictures. The picture on the left is the structure of the cytochrome BC1 complex. This is the part here in the membrane. Notice again these alpha helices that pass through the membrane. That is a structural motif of membrane-bound proteins. The alpha helix has all of its NH and carbonyl groups internally hydrogen bonded, so it is a very hydrophobic structure, and it fits very nicely within the membrane. So there's the membrane. There's cytochrome Bl. There's cytochrome BH. There's the QO site. There is the QI site. Here is the iron sulfur protein in the position down here near the site. There is cytochrome C1. And so what happens, the Q comes into that site, delivers the first electron to the iron sulfur. Now see that little loop there? We believe that plays an important role. The next thing that happens is that iron sulfur rotates to this position up here. It has to move that EF loop out of the way. Once it gets up there, it can deliver the electron to C1, but we believe it is prevented from moving back until the electron comes down here to Bl and BH. So that's what the current evidence is for the mechanism of the cytochrome BC1 complex. Okay, are there any questions on that before I go on? Okay, now this next protein is very interesting. This is the largest and most complicated of the electron transfer proteins in the mitochondrial respiratory chain. It has a molecular weight of about 1 million. It has 47 different subunits. It's an absolute monster. And this is the last of these mitochondrial proteins for which a crystal structure has been determined. And Dr. Sassanov succeeded in doing this just this last summer. In fact, I saw an update of this in Germany at the conference that I went to a couple of weeks ago, and he's got an updated picture of this. And so this is what it looks like right here. Now I have to tell you first of all that this is drawn upside down relative to all of the diagrams I've drawn. So this corresponds to the inside of the mitochondria, the matrix. That corresponds down here to the outside of the mitochondria, the inner membrane space. He does this because this is actually a bacterial complex one, and they have different compartments. So up here is the flavin mononucleotide that we talked about previously. There is a series, as you can see, of about 7 different iron sulfur centers, each represented by that little orange ball. And they provide a pathway for electrons from FMN down to the coenzyme Q that we have down here. Then we have a series of 3 subunits that are able to pump protons, and another subunit right here that's more closely
here you see 4 different sites. Now, in the oxidized form, before the NADH is derived, we can take up these 4 protons at these 4 different sites there to begin with. We can think of that as the loading phase of the reaction. Then we add NADH. It transfers its electrons to FMN, and they are then relayed by the 7 iron sulfur proteins all the way down here to reduce Q to QH2. And that then introduces a large conformational change in this membrane part of the protein. In fact, there is a long alpha helix running parallel to the membrane, which is very unusual. And this is kind of like the long crankshaft on the old steam locomotive. You've seen those in old movies, and you might have seen it live. There's various steam locomotives still taking trains around the country. But that is just like that long crankshaft, and each of these subunits is like one of those big locomotive wheels. So when the electrons come down here and reduce to QH2, that crankshaft is pulled back that way. It changes the conformation of all 4 of those subunits. It closes the door to the protons coming in from the top here, and it opens the door to the protons going out the bottom and forces these 4 protons out again. So that's how this enzyme is thought to operate now, based on the research of Dr. Sassanov and a number of other laboratories around the world. So let's go through that again. You start out in the oxidized state. Protons are loaded into those sites where there's glutamic acid and lysine residue that can accept protons. The electrons then come down here. The crankshaft moves that way. The bottom part moves that way. The top channel for protons is closed off. Bottom channels are opened up. The protons are kicked out. And that is what constitutes the mechanism for proton pumping by this enzyme. So it's really a remarkable enzyme. One thing we don't know yet very much about is the actual kinetics of this process. So we're hopeful that that will be forthcoming. Okay, any questions about this complex 1? Okay, now I'm going to talk about a couple of other topics that are related to this that have more medical significance. One of the problems with the cytochrome, with the whole mitochondrial respiratory chain, is that we have electrons that are highly reducing. And I talked to you a little bit about that last period. And what that can do is that if we have highly reducing electrons, it can react with oxygen to form this highly toxic molecule of O2 minus, superoxide. And that is a bad player. It is one of the major sources of aging and various types of degenerative diseases. And as you'll see in just a minute, it is also a major cause of the damage to tissue caused by heart attack and stroke. So it is a very serious problem. And the O2 minus is largely produced at 2 places. Number 1, in the complex 1 that we just talked about. Number 2, at the QO site of the cytochrome BC1 complex that we just talked about. That's the major site of the production of O2 minus. Now, the enzymes are set up so that under normal circumstances we don't produce much O2 minus. And if we produce a little bit of it, there are enzymes that react with it and prevent its damaging effects. The superoxide dismutase is an example of that, and your textbook goes through that. The cytochrome oxidase, as I mentioned, has a mechanism that prevents the formation of O2 minus by injecting 4 electrons all at once into the oxygen molecule. We don't get much O2 minus with this one here. Now, the other question that's related to this is how is the activity of the entire mitochondrial respiratory chain regulated? it turns out that the major regulation site for the respiratory chain is the reaction between cytochrome C and cytochrome oxidase. And this type of regulation is mediated in a similar fashion to some other regulatory enzymes we've talked about. Specific residues on cytochrome C can be phosphorylated, likewise in cytochrome oxidase. When these residues are phosphorylated, it slows down this reaction and slows down the entire respiratory chain. So this is a major site of regulation in humans and other vertebrate animals, this phosphorylation of cytochrome C. So if you need rapid electron transfer, the cytochrome C is dephosphorylated. If you've got a lot of energy and you want to slow it down because you don't need to make more energy, this then becomes phosphorylated and we slow the reaction down. And these two mechanisms, this regulation, largely prevents the formation of superoxide by these two enzymes here. So the regulation not only controls the rate, which is important, it also minimizes the formation of these superoxide molecules. So this, I'll come back to that in just a second. This is kind of a messy picture of our collaborator at Wayne State University, Mike Sutherland. And this shows cytochrome oxidase. Again, the whole molecule, see all these nice transmembrane alpha helices. The cytochrome C binding site is right here. This is actually the dimer. Here is cytochrome C. And these are the sites that can be phosphorylated to inhibit and regulate the reaction between cytochrome C and cytochrome oxidase. And there's a bunch of other sites here on the oxidase that can be phosphorylated, and they do the same thing. They regulate its activity, okay? And we are now studying how the phosphorylation of these sites affects the rapid kinetics, the detailed kinetics of the reaction with cytochrome oxidase. Now, here is the problem that we get into. If we have normal mitochondria, that everything's going on in a healthy fashion, we have the cytochrome oxidase and cytochrome C phosphorylated, we regulate the activity. The potential across the membrane is about 120 millivolts. I gave you a number of 0.1 volts, you remember, and that's 120 is a pretty good number here. Everything's very good. We're not making much superoxide. However, what happens during heart attack or stroke? First of all, the oxygen, the clot in the brain or the heart blocks the flow of blood. That blocks the flow of oxygen to the tissue affected. That makes that tissue completely anaerobic, and we call that ischemia when it becomes anaerobic. The entire mitochondrial respiratory chain shuts down. Now that's not so damaging. That tissue can take up to an hour of no oxygen without that much damage. However, what causes the damage, in most cases in stroke and heart attack, is when the blood first rushes back in after the clot has been removed. That's called reperfusion injury. That is the bulk of the damage following a stroke or a heart attack. What happens here is that once the oxygen is removed, you enter the ischemia state. The phosphate groups are all removed, so you can prime the oxidase and cytochrome C for maximum activity. There is no activity because there's no oxygen, there's no place for the electrons to go, but it's primed to really take off. Then we bring back in the oxygen, the clot is removed, and before we can rephosphorylate all these groups, we have a hyperactive state in which we have much faster electron transfer than we normally do. That produces an enormous voltage across the membrane, okay, 180 millivolts. That is what causes the production of superoxide. That then destroys the tissue and causes cell death. So the damage in heart attack and stroke is not caused primarily by the initial lack of oxygen, but by the reperfusion entry, the oxygen coming in, causing these mitochondria to be hyperactive, produce lots of O2 minus, and then give rise to that. So we're carrying out studies of how this phosphorylation state controls all of that reaction, and trying to understand this process in greater detail. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, now the biggie. Let me just, going back to this picture here, as I mentioned, if that goes out of control, then we get very rapid electron transfer, and we produce the superoxide here and here. The next enzyme I'm going to talk about is this ATP synthase enzyme right over here. There is a table in your textbook that I think is useful. This just shows all of the diseases that are associated with the production of O2 minus and other toxic materials that are derived from O2 minus, and they're called ROS for short, or reactive oxygen species. They just call these free radicals in this table. But this ischemia and reperfusion entry is what I just talked about. And all of these other diseases are associated with this superoxide production getting out of control. So this is a very important medical problem, as you can see here. Okay, now I call this one the biggie because it's, in some respects, one of the most interesting members of this family. This is the ATP synthase enzyme. Again, I have to apologize. Most of the pictures that I have are turned upside down compared to what the previous pictures. So this is the outside of the membrane. This is the matrix of the membrane right here. Okay, the ATP synthase is another very large protein complex. It is composed of two parts that can actually be separated from one another. The FO part is the part which is in the mitochondrial membrane, as you can see here. It is composed minimally of three subunits, an A subunit, a B subunit, and then a variable number of C subunits. That says 10 to 14. We now know that number is 8 to 16. I'll get to that in a minute here. We then have the FO component, or the F1 component, that is in the matrix, in the aqueous layer of the matrix. It is composed of three alpha subunits and three beta subunits. The betas are colored yellow, the alphas are colored red. Then there is a connector here, as you can see here, between the membrane part and the part, the F1, which is on the outside of the membrane. Moreover, there is a connector here that's called the rotor between this C10 rotor that we have here and the F1 component over here. Now, what this is a molecular machine, and it's actually a rotary engine. If you've seen old World War I movies, you know the old rotary engines they had on the old biplanes that flew in World War I had about 8 cylinders around in a circular fashion and a central crankshaft. This looks just about like that. This part here is the rotor of the system, and this is driven by proton pumping, as you can see here. The protons on the outside of the membrane go through this rotor, cause it to rotate, and they're delivered to what is now the inside of the membrane. This rotor is attached to the crankshaft that consists of the subunits gamma and epsilon. The crankshaft rotates within the F1 subunit, changing the conformation of these alpha and beta subunits in such a fashion that the ATP is synthesized up here, actually at the interface between the alpha and the beta subunit. We'll see this a little bit later. So, and then this part is called the stator. that holds this part fixed and that part fixed. So all of this is fixed, that's fixed, that rotates, the crankshaft rotates. So going back again to the beginning, the protons flow through this thing, the crankshaft rotates, the C10 rotor rotates, caused by the proton pumping. The crankshaft is attached to that, it rotates within these alpha and beta subunits of the F1. You can think of this as the cylinders of the engine, and then you can think of the gamma as the crankshaft, and the pistons are in here changing the conformation of that beta subunit to allow the synthesis of ATP. So that's how the whole thing works. And I think before going on to the next one, what I'm going to do here is show you a little movie of this. Oh, it's already running. Okay. I'm going to speed it up. It's more fun if it goes faster. Okay. So, this is a cartoon that has been made based on the X-ray crystal structures that have been done here. Here is that rotor, okay? That is composed of the C subunits. Each of these subunits has an aspartic acid which can carry a proton. Remember that most membrane protons have no charge groups within this hydrophobic environment, but there is one aspartic acid that can carry that proton. So the proton from the outside of the membrane comes in here, is delivered to that aspartic acid in each of those C subunits. That causes it to rotate all the way around. It's then delivered to this output channel, and the proton is kicked out there. That rotates the crankshaft, which is attached to the C1 rotor. That changes the conformation of these beta subunits, as you can see here, and that causes the synthesis of ATP. That might be going just a little too fast, so I will slow this down a little bit. Not too slow, but maybe just about like that. On the PowerPoint slide, I've put you the link to this picture so you can look at it in greater detail. And let's follow what's going on here. And let's look at this thing right here. It first binds an ATP, then releases it. So an ADP and phosphate bind, then it's converted to ATP, and then it is released. So each of these beta subunits independently synthesizes ATP as the crankshaft rotates within this ATP synthase. And all of this stuff is scattered to keep everything else fixed, as you can see. That rotates, that changes the crankshaft, that changes the conformation of the active site, which allows the synthesis of ATP. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. We'll just keep that thing running there. This just shows what I've already talked about here. But this right here, the critical thing here is that's a very hydrophobic bunch of alpha helices. Each of those C subunits has 2 alpha helices. And it has an aspartic acid residue that can, first of all, be a COO minus, and it's only a COO minus at one time here. But what happens? Ooh. So let me write this over here. So that COO minus reacts with a proton to make COOH. And where is this kind of reaction occurring here? It's actually, COO minus is only going to be present right in this position here. So those protons then combine with the COO minus that's right here, bind that proton, and what we represent as COOH is what they're calling this H. So that's that aspartic acid residue with its proton. It's all the way around there, And then it delivers its proton, becomes a CO minus again. The proton goes out the top. And what drives the whole thing is this membrane potential, composed of both a pH gradient and a voltage across the membrane. So that drives that drives the crankshaft, that drives the change in conformation at the active site where ATP is synthesized in the beta subunit. Now, this is a top view of these beta subunits, and it's showing the reactions that occur. There's 3 of these subunits. Each in turn goes through this cycle of ATP synthase. So one complete rotation of the crankshaft is able to synthesize 3 molecules of ATP, 1 on each of the subunits. So let's follow this top subunit here. It starts out in what we call the L conformation, which means loose binding of ATP. And what happens is ADP and phosphate bind to this loose conformation, and then they just sit there. Nothing happens. But then the next thing that happens is the crankshaft rotates, powered by the proton rotor. And you see that little crankshaft? It moves over there. And the conformations of all 3 subunits change when that crankshaft, that central green thing, moves to that position. This used to be a loose binding site. It's now a tight binding site. Let's follow along. It brings the ADP and phosphate close together, and it allows the synthesis of ATP to occur. The conformation of the active site drives the synthesis of ATP. Meanwhile, what's been happening to the other site? Here's this lower one down here. It started out as a tight site. It's one of the interesting things about this mechanism is even though we synthesize ATP, we can't release it. It binds so tightly, it's stuck there. But when we have the rotation of the crankshaft, this becomes what is called the O site or the open site. ATP is then released. So the turn of the crankshaft is needed to convert that site from tight to open and release the ATP. We can then follow what's happening over here. This is initially an open site. It then becomes a loose site. In the next stage of the mechanism down here, the ATP would bind and we continue. So this is just 1/3 of a complete revolution. We've synthesized 1 ATP in 1/3 of a revolution. In a complete revolution, we are going to be synthesizing 3 molecules of ATP. These are the links I talk about. That's the movie we just saw. This is another link to some other movies. A lot of people have made some very pretty movies of this mechanism. Okay, this is a text picture in your textbook. It's pretty much the same, but I thought it's good to look at a couple of these things. Same idea, and we have these same sites. We start out here in what is, again, loose, open type. He's showing both the betas and the alpha subunits in this picture here. Let's just start out here. This is a tight site. We favor the synthesis of ATP, but it cannot be released because it binds so tightly. And then we can see the sequence of the different reactions down here. So what we see here, we start out with that in the tight site, that in the loose, that in the open. The crankshaft moves, this becomes open, that ATP is now released, and then this site that was previously loose now becomes tight, and we allow the synthesis of ATP to occur. They are at equilibrium, but it's so tight we can't release the ATP. Further down, when we turn the crankshaft one more time, that ATP will be released. So it's a beautiful rotary engine, as you can see here. Okay, let's see what else we've got. Okay, this is a blow-up of the active site. And you can see here, this is the ADP molecule. There's the adenine base. Here's the ribose ring. Those are the 2 phosphates. Here is the incoming phosphate in a transition state. Here is the water that used to be associated with that phosphate. So this is what they believe the active site of the enzyme looks at the transition state of the reaction. We are beginning to form the bond between phosphate, inorganic phosphate, and the second of the phosphates on the ATP. We are beginning to break the bond with water. Notice what we have around that active site. We have two arginines. Positive charges on these stabilize the negative charges on these phosphates. There's a lysine up here that's the same deal. Here's a glutamate. And what that does is it acts as a general base that pulls that proton away from the oxygen here that is now, or I think it donates the proton to the oxygen that is now going to become water. So this is the transition state. We start out with ADP and phosphate with its water. Then we attach the phosphate to the ADP to make ATP, and the water is released. So this is the actual transition state, and it is the conformation that changes with the active site that allows this reaction to occur. Again, the energy is the following. It's all based initially on the membrane potential. That drives the protons from the outside to the inside of the mitochondrial membrane. That rotates the C rotor. That then rotation of the C rotor then causes this conformation to change through those three states we saw in the previous slide. And that conformational change at the active site is what drives the synthesis of ATP. So if you look at the entire mitochondrial respiratory chain, we are seeing that the energy is transformed to different forms all along the way. You start out with the energy of electron transfer. That is converted to the energy of the membrane potential. That is used to pump protons across the rotor of the ATP synthase. That's converted into conformational energy at the active site of the ATP synthase, the beta subunit. That drives the synthesis of ATP. So it's a remarkable example of different forms of energy being transformed in the different steps of the reaction. Here's another picture of that transition state, what we think it looks like, the ADP over there. This transition state, kind of a trigonal flat form of the phosphate during the transition state. There is the water that is being released. So, and those are projected types of bond lengths. We know something about this transition state because people have developed artificial transition state mimics that would bind to the ATP synthase that would have this type of trigonal flat planar type of structure that mimic what we think the transition state looks like. Okay, let me show you just a few more movies here. I think, yeah, the next one is a different topic. So let me just, we've already looked at this interesting movie, so that's kind of fun. Okay, now let's look at another movie if I can find it. Okay, this shows what's going on here. Now, this is showing what's going on in the beta subunits. That is the crankshaft, that sort of gray and blue thing. And then these red things are the beta subunits. And you can see as that rotates, all of that structure is changing there. So we have the three betas in red, the three alphas in yellow, the crankshaft is blue and gray, and everything's moving around. And that active site is changing its structure to favor the synthesis of ATP. I think I've got a few more of these. Let's just throw up, yeah, this will be fun. Okay, let's get this guy running. I should fill the screen with these pictures. Okay, this is the same thing, but a blow-up just showing one beta subunit on the left, one alpha subunit on the right. As that crankshaft rotates, you can see there's two domains within that beta subunit. the ATP is synthesized right there. You can see that's exactly where the structural element is being located. I think I have another blow up that will look at that.
Is the alpha beta interface or the alpha gamma interface?
Let me get back to that.
Oh dear.
Okay.
So the green.
Say it again. I didn't hear you.
Is the ATP synthesized the alpha beta interface or the alpha gamma? Is that right there the alpha gamma interface?
That's the gamma. Both of those are betas, different domains of the betas. It's synthesized right there, but it's adjacent to an alpha that's not shown in this picture. The active site is actually at an interface between the alpha and beta subunits. But for simplicity, this is just a cutaway picture showing one beta on the left and one alpha on the right. Okay. Then I've got one more picture here of this, and this is it right here. And again, all of these are available to you on the internet at the sites that I indicated there. And this now is showing what's going on within the beta subunit. There is the ATP kind of superimposed. It's not a great picture, but you get the idea. There's really a massive change in conformation which is driving the synthesis of that ATP molecule. Okay? Okay, any other questions on the ATP? Really an amazing enzyme. One thing I might just add, there's two things I wanted to add to this. I can find my way back. Where do I want to? Probably a good thing. I told you that the number of these C subunits in the rotor is variable. So let me do a little bit of stuff with the stoichiometry. For every 2 electrons, maybe a better line out there, when we went down the respiratory chain, we had 1 NADH, corresponds to 2 electrons. How many protons does that pump? We will say 10 protons. Okay? Then we had down here, we have the ATP synthase, and let's think a little bit about this. 1 rotation equals 3 ATP. Okay? Now, the stoichiometry of protons per ATP depends on how many of these C subunits we have here. Because as you can see, the number of C subunits determines how many protons are pumped here per complete rotation. If we have 10 subunits, as is shown here, that's 10 protons per 1 rotation. So 1 rotation also equals number of protons equals number of C subunits. Okay? Now, it was discovered within the last year that the number of C subunits in our own ATP synthase is not 10 or 12, it is 8. So the number of C in all the vertebrates is equal to 8. Okay? That means 1 rotation of make 3 ATP requires 8 protons to be transported. So, in other words, we have the number of protons needed for 1 ATP synthase is going to be 8 over 3 is 2.7. That is the basis of that reaction that I told you about. That I said 2.7 protons need to be transported to synthesize 1 ATP molecule. So we have 8 per rotation, we get 3 ATPs per rotation. That is protons per 1 ATP is 2.7. Now, let's come back to here. I think you can see that the 10 protons is sufficient to drive at least 3 ATPs. The number that we actually get experimentally is 2.5 ATPs. Okay? So every 2 electrons plus 10 protons, and then ends up synthesizing 2.5 ATP molecules. Now, the reason that there's a little more protons pumped by the respiratory chain that are needed for the synthesis of ATP is because of these molecules right here. As you can see here, there are some exchange proteins. We already talked about the ATP-ADP exchange. You can see that right here. An ATP is going outside, and an ADP is going inside. There's also a phosphate exchange, and these use some of the energy of that membrane potential to carry out this transport right here. So some of these protons that are transported as a result of electron transfer drive the ATP synthase. Most of them do that, but we need a few more to drive this exchange of the ATP out of the membrane and the phosphate into the membrane. Okay, let me see where we are then. I just had 1 or 2 more pictures to show you here. And let's look at this one here. This is just a little thing. There's a lot of things that in the respiratory chain of the mitochondria that allow the transport. As we talked about earlier, the mitochondrial membrane by itself is completely impermeable to all molecules unless there is a specific transport protein. Now, we do generate some NADH out in the cytoplasm as a result of this glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, one of the citric acid cycle intermediates. And what we do here then is this molecule is reacted with a protein bound to the membrane that contains an FAD residue. The reducing power is transferred from the glycerol 3-phosphate to the FADH2. Then that generates dihydroxyacetone phosphate, and the FADH2 is used to reduce coenzyme Q to QH2, and then that donates its electrons to the cytochrome BC1 complex and to cytochrome oxidase. Remember, an FAD only generates 1.5 ATPs per electron pair, 1 less than we get out of NADH. So cytoplasmic NADH only generates 1.5 ATPs. And that number of 30 ATPs per glucose that I gave you last period, that takes this reaction into account. There are other transport processes. This is given in your textbook. It involves a lot of amino acids, so I didn't think I'd go over this, but this occurs primarily in liver and heart, and it allows the transport of NADH in a more efficient way, and you actually, with this mechanism, get the full 2.5 ATPs in cytoplasmic NADH. And I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of this transport protein. This is the ADP-ATP exchange protein. That little red dot there is going to represent ATP. You can see it is a dimeric protein that kind of flips back and forth like this. It is first open to the outside, and it releases the ATP to the outside. It binds ADP from the outside. It then flips, delivers this ADP to the inside, then picks up an ATP from the inside, flips back, and delivers it again to the outside. So that's how that ATP transport protein works. It requires that for each ATP that's delivered to the outside, an ADP has to be delivered to the inside. And here's a couple of other transport proteins, and I just list these here. These are given in this picture is given in your textbook. That's the same one we just talked about. the ADP, ATP translocase. This is the phosphate exchange protein. It exchanges phosphate for OH minus, and it is driven also by the membrane gradient, the membrane potential, and that was shown in our cartoon. We then have a pyruvate OH minus transport carrier, a citrate malate carrier, a malate phosphate carrier. In each of these, we pair the transport of malate to the transport of phosphate, or the transport of citrate to the transport of malate, and so forth. So we have a lot of carriers for molecules to get in and out of the mitochondria as is needed. Okay, I think that's all I've got in the mitochondrial respiratory chain. So let's take a brief break. I'm just going to say a few introductory remarks, and what I'm going to do for the rest of the course, I'm changing the order of the chapters rather dramatically. I'm jumping next all the way to amino acids. The reason I do that is that they integrate so completely with the citric acid cycle. I wanted to do that before you forgot about the citric acid cycle. So we're jumping all the way to the amino acids now. And what I'm going to do in these chapters is just focus on what I consider the essential topics. So you're really only responsible for what I cover in class on some of these metabolic chapters. I'm going to try to list on the blackboard the pages in your textbook that correspond to the topics I'm covering in class. So we're not going to cover all of these chapters. In the amino acids that I'm going to cover next, I'm going to look at the overall plan for amino acid degradation and synthesis, but I'm only going to look at the details for certain representative amino acids. There's really 20 different stories. I'm not going to give all 20 of those stories, but I'm going to just look at representative examples. Okay, so let's take a brief break, and then we'll be ready to start again.